my pleasure to welcome everyone today. And for those who are watching us online, thank you so much for tuning in and joining us this afternoon for what I hope is going to be a very educational, informative, interactive, and fun session for us. We've picked a topic that is, well, let's say topical, around ransomware, but we want to take it to the next level and talk about extortionware this afternoon. And there are many dimensions to that, and I'm delighted to be joined by this panel of experts who are going to help us navigate through this minefield, shall we call it, and explore some of those different dimensions. And I'm going to let each of them explain a little bit about their own role and their focus area as we go through the conversation this afternoon. But let me start by introducing myself. My name is Peter Finter. I am the Chief Marketing Officer for CyberGRX. We are an exchange for third-party cyber risk information to help companies manage that very important part of their businesses. And I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon, firstly on my left here, by Ben Carr, who is the Global Chief Information Security Officer with Qualys, a company that's itself focused on security and cybersecurity and dealing with all aspects of that. Ben has a storied history. We're going to hear a little bit more about that from him this afternoon. Next to Ben, we have David Stapleton. Dave is the Chief Information Security Officer for CyberGRX. So working with our clients and our partners, members of the exchange, looking at our own security as well as theirs through that lens. And finally, but by no means least, Tim Chapman. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Tim. Director of Security Assurance at ADP. Well known to all of us in the room and interacting with thousands of cybersecurity professionals in the course of a normal day, as it would seem from the way Tim tells the story. So, three very distinguished guests, and let's get straight into our conversation this afternoon. And I wanted to start, if I may, Dave, by maybe asking you to give us a little bit of an update on the world of ransomware. What's happening these days? Why is it so pervasive?
Yeah, so I'm sure everyone here is quite familiar with ransomware, so I won't spend a lot of time on a background, but I think it's important for the context to think about the history of it just a little bit. If you think about the beginning, the first kind of example of ransomware was in 1989, and it came loaded on floppy disk, for those of us old enough to remember floppy disks. And I think the ransom did your typical encryption of data and requiring some decryption key. The ransom itself was, I think, $189, so really steep prices. That's changed significantly, and you had to actually send the money to a PO box. No internet, no cryptocurrency at that time. So we've come quite a long way since those early days of ransomware. And I think to your point, the pervasiveness of it, what we're seeing now is actually in the last year a decrease in the volume of ransomware attacks, but it's interesting because you feel like you're hearing about it all the time. I believe the primary motivation and reason for that is that it's profitable. It's extremely profitable. Some estimates say that organizations in the US this year are going to be paying upwards of $20 billion in ransom, which is just an insane amount of money, and of course that's a big motivator for threat actors. And I think what they're doing is they're bringing to bear greater resources to try to develop more sophisticated types of attacks. They're going after also bigger, more prominent targets, which is another reason why it feels like we're just inundated with ransomware right now. The mainstream media is talking about it because they're hitting critical infrastructure targets, really large global retailers like Apple, that sort of thing, and it really brings it to people's attention. So I think that's some of the reasons for what we see right now is the pervasiveness of ransomware.
Maybe we should do a quick straw poll for those of us in the room here. I wonder if your organizations have been directly affected by ransomware up to this point, meaning either people that you work with that are part of your ecosystem or maybe yourselves. Not asking you to disclose any confidential information, but if you have been impacted by ransomware through one of your suppliers or through your ecosystem at large, would you just raise your hand just to get a sense for how pervasive is it really? Well, for those watching online, if you can't see the audience, that's a good number of people in the room. So this is something that is clearly becoming a reality for more and more of us to deal with. But we titled this very intentionally about extortionware, and I wanted to just ask you to help us understand what is the difference between when we're talking about ransomware and we're talking about extortionware, and why is extortionware now the topic that we should be focusing on?
Yeah, I think in some ways extortionware might be a better word for all of this to begin with, but we didn't know that in advance. So, ransomware, your traditional ransomware is some sort of encryption data stores, rendering systems inoperable, requiring some kind of a ransom to be paid in order to get a decryption key and return your systems to operability. That's kind of the traditional definition of ransomware that we've talked about for so long. I think because of innovation, frankly, on the part of threat actors and criminal organizations, what we're seeing is kind of like they innovate, we innovate, they innovate, we innovate. We're kind of like always stepping over each other in a bit of a cat and mouse game, which is pretty typical of cybersecurity. That innovation is a catalyst for the evolution of what we're now referring to as extortionware. Now that comes in a lot of different forms. I think most people are probably familiar with the two-stage type of ransomware attack where the encryption certainly happens quite often, but in addition to that, we have exfil of IP, other sensitive data, and then the sort of secondary ransom that's applied to that is, if you don't pay this, we may release this to parties that will hurt you, hurt your business and your success, that kind of thing. But it's going to even a step further than that. There are things like threats of distributed denial of service attacks associated with it. Same thing. If you don't pay this ransom, we're going to DDoS you. There's name and shame sites that people are using, saying, "Hey, look, we successfully hacked your company. We're going to make sure everybody knows about it." So we're going to, they'll reach directly out to the media to kind of share that information, reputational risk, that kind of thing, all with the intent of motivating us to pay them a ransom. So it's evolved, I think, pretty significantly away from the early days of just encrypting a data store and demanding a ransom for it.
Yeah, I think you brought up an interesting point where you talked about how it's an escalation, right? Where it's us versus them escalation point. And I think it's important to note that I think it's really about monetization, right? It's a way for the threat actor, whether it be government, individual, criminal organization, to figure out how to capitalize and turn an event into a monetization event. And so anytime they can figure out how to address that, how to pull in dollars, they're going to look to take that next step in the evolution of it. And so that's what we're seeing a lot, even to the point of, when you think about extortionware, you have an event as a company, but then that data that was then exfiltrated, the threat actors are now not just going to the company where the data was exfiltrated, but they're going to the third party, the data that's owned by someone else that they exfiltrated, and they're saying, hey, we've extorted, the first person in the chain, but now we're extorting, you, because we happen to have your data because it was leaked from company X. And so as a result, if you don't pay us, we're going to release your information. And it's, you weren't even hosting that, it's hosted by someone else, right? And so that constant evolution of the actors trying to figure out how to address a new monetization scheme is something that's really fueling that fire.
I've even heard, it's crazy, ransomware gangs threatening to contact short sellers in advance and basically say, look, we're getting ready to release all this information, this company's stock's going to tank, short it. Like it's crazy, but yeah, you're right. They're just chasing any sort of monetization scheme they can get.
We're talking about an industry that is evolving and developing very, very rapidly.
Well, I think that's ultimately the point. Is like you can't think of these. I think traditionally we thought of these people as threat actors, right? I think you need to pivot. People need to start thinking about as business entities that are trying to figure out a way to create a monetization event, and so. They're not after you because they want to hack into your system. I mean, there are certainly nation state and other issues that we see that are those kind of things. But ultimately, when we talk about like ransomware and extortionware, it's a business, and they're trying to figure out how to run a business, right? And you'd be surprised at the back end process and how that's actually operationalized, right? Where they're figuring out the most cost-effective way to generate a revenue stream and to do it at massive scale. And so, we've seen that, with selling credit card numbers earlier. We've seen that selling with ransomware. We've seen it, emerge into extortion. It's a business, and these business entities, criminal organizations, but nonetheless business entities, are figuring out a way to turn it into a real business for them.
Tim.
Well, I was going to say, there's a real value in the brand image damage, right? The reputation aspect and so forth. I think we've seen that. It's, hey, we're going to release. You're going to suffer some sort of impact, not just the loss of exfil data and so forth, but your brand is going to take a significant hit and so forth. And if you kind of playing off the leadership emotions, if you will, and say, look, and maybe it's worth to pay, and then they have to have those conversations, not just from the value of the IP and so forth, but the value of the brand.
It's a really good point, and I think I came across some data earlier today which suggested that over 40% of people who paid to have their data returned to them found that it was corrupted data that was returned, and 80% who had paid then experienced a subsequent attack. So this is something that is building upon itself, and it's creating, as you rightly pointed out, business opportunity is probably the best way to say it. That is bringing people into that environment as we'd expect from any innovative business, meaning entrepreneurship is on the rise as it pertains to this new criminal activity. And I think that creates some very special challenges for organizations like ours that are on the receiving end of these ransomware threats and extortionware actions as we've been describing. And I wanted to ask Tim, maybe from your point of view, are there any particular characteristics of extortionware or ransomware that make it more difficult to defend against?
Aspects of the attack itself, I think, I think it kind of probably precluded my own comment. Really, it's just really kind of playing on those emotions and really what more looking at from the impact of what's going to happen from a reputation perspective, but it really kind of focuses in on what exposes, I think, a lot of process gaps and so forth when we're talking about why is extortionware is somewhat effective and so forth. It's not just that initial attack vector and so forth, but everything that has to take place between knowing when something has happened all the way until trying to get through recovery, and and obviously, as we've seen from a reputation perspective, the longer that process takes, how long does it take to disclose, how long does it take to mitigate and so forth, how long does it take to decide what they're going to do. Organizations may or may not be fully prepared for those conversations and that response. It really is that time delay also, like I said, is deeply impactful to an organization and their reputation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sequence of multiple activities that's required, including preparation. We'll come on and talk a little bit more about how do we actually solve for this problem, but just to flesh it out just that little bit more, I wanted to ask Ben, from your point of view, as you think about third parties, and you've already opened that conversation up a little bit when you were talking about the fact that it's not just the data that's exfiltrated, it's whose data is that, and where was that originated from, and what door does that open up? Maybe you can just say a little bit more about why third parties are such an attractive target for ransomware or extortionware attacks.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think it lends itself to also where Tim was going in your question to him about why it's difficult to defend against, right? It may not necessarily be an attack against you or your company that lands you in the sphere, the spectrum of being under, again, extortion, right? If we're talking about, that third-party chain, it goes quite far, right? We often talk about third-party risk and how we look at third parties and our relationship with them, but it's really more of an nth-party risk, right? I think driving down that chain and seeing how you deal with it and then how your suppliers deal with their suppliers and the potential for your data to be essentially compromised in a ransomware or an extortion event, right? And I think extortion is more impactful, I think, in that case, right? If the data gets encrypted and they don't pay, you still want to know about it, you're concerned, right? But if the data doesn't get exposed, it's less of an interest. But when that extortion event happens, it really doesn't matter how far down the chain it is. If it's 6 steps away, that's still a problem for you if they're holding that data under an extortion attempt and saying, we're going to release this information, right? And the confidentiality and sensitivity of that data is going to certainly have an impact on that. I think, when I think about third party, it's just an area where it's in everybody's mind because of things that we've seen in the news, right? We've obviously seen SolarWinds, we've seen Escalation, we've seen Microsoft, we've seen it go on and on, right? Where it's that supply chain that really is hosting, and especially as people have moved to cloud services and SaaS, that data is out there, right? And so you really have to be concerned with understanding and owning the risk profile of where that data is located and that it could be involved in some type of extortion or ransomware event.
I think another that I would just kind of add on to that is third parties oftentimes can be, I think, a softer target than a primary target. And since we entrust third parties with so much of our critical data, if that's what they're going after, or they want to have some leverage against us as companies, going after and targeting our third parties is a pretty smart move if you think about it. I think the issue with Apple recently and Quanta was one of their manufacturers, has a lot of their IP. It was a pretty smart move, if you will. I hate to compliment the adversary, but to go after Quanta and then apply that leverage to demand a $50 million ransom from Apple, to not expose this IP and potentially have them suffer a lot of business consequences with
I
like
think you take it
competitive
a
advantage.
level above the smart, right? And say it's less smart and more economic.
Well,
Like, right? I mean,
Right.
like what's the cost
Practical.
of going after a really hard target versus what's the cost of going after somebody who may be less secure or less informed, or even if you take it to that the nth party like 4 or 5 steps away. How likely is it you're going to be aware of that, right? So as they target those entities to get into their actual target, it's a real threat.
Yeah.
So they can pivot to their other, right?
Yeah.
You may have other, well-known clients of that third party, right? So they can then pivot from them, from the reputation perspective, again, or to target multiple, right?
Well, and
Exactly.
I think SolarWinds and Kaseya, right? Like
Correct.
if you look at those, like that target one, and you're targeting 1,000, right? And so if that third-party breach or exposure takes you down that path of having a very wide attack path that you have, that's gold for the threat actor.
Economies of scale.
Yeah,
Absolutely, and the leverage is enormous, isn't it? And the fact is that we're all part of digital ecosystems where we act as customers and consumers of data from third-party suppliers to us, and we act as third parties to our customers, and we're all part of that interlinked chain. And I think, as you said, Ben, it's not just a one-to-one relationship, it's a nested set of relationships. It's an extremely complex web, and I think it's good for us to start talking a little bit about how can we actually address this issue? What is it that we should be doing to protect ourselves and our organizations, and what are the new strategies and tactics that are emerging? But maybe to start that conversation, we should be starting with what constitutes best practice for today? And I mean, Tim, your organization deals with thousands and thousands of customers. And as you engage with each of those relationships, they're coming to you, asking you to verify and validate your cyber risk posture to give them confidence that you are going to be a good third party for them. What does that look like today, and what constitutes sort of best practices from your point of view as you are acting as the third party to them?
I can definitely speak to what's happening today, and I think I think best practice, today might not necessarily. I think there's a lot of opportunity in growth and maturity. I'll be honest. So what I mean by that is essentially, so part of my role at ADP and so forth is that we ingest, like I said, close to about 5,500 inquiries from our clients a year. The typical starting off with due diligence, questionnaire based, very linear, do you have a program? Yes or no. Do you have a policy? Yes or no. Do you have malware protection? Yes or no. But then it's usually, like I said, very surface level. It's very important, obviously, to get that work done and set a baseline. But then when I won't hear from a client again until an event, such as a Kaseya, a SolarWinds, and what have you. And at that point, they're asking, okay, have you been impacted by this? And there's really nothing in between from what I'm seeing, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity in those conversations in between, or to ask them a little bit more in-depth questions. Like I mentioned again, the things downstream, and understanding how I act with our customers as a third party and so forth. But maybe asking, instead of have you been impacted and so forth, asking questions like, do you have a plan? Have you a plan? Not just an incident response plan, but a plan to address ransomware and so forth. Have you had the conversations with the multiple stakeholders that it takes once, if there is an event? And how do you work through that and so forth? And understand that maybe, and from that posture maturity perspective, really understand where the organization is, and not just work within the compliance linear space.
Yeah, I don't know if you see it the same way I do, but when I look at organizations and I talk to peers and colleagues, like often what I see from a third party side is exactly what you said. It's a very surface level assessment, right? I just think yes or no questions don't get at the risk. I think you need to have a deeper conversation than a yes or a no. Like, how are you doing that? Okay, you said yes, but like, how are you consistently validating that, right? So it's often a point in time, and then when you really get down and dig for that, I'm not seeing a lot of good answers come out of it, right? And so that's just it's challenging to see that. And then sitting on both sides, I think you mentioned it's kind of a multi-part conversation. Like, we're often thinking about the perspective that we have, and so I sit in the middle between having to answer a lot of the same kind of things, questions that people are asking me, but then I sit on the other side trying to ask my suppliers, my vendors, like what are you doing to address this, right? And trying to have those intellectual conversations with them to really get a real assessment of the risk and kind of benchmark it and figure out like where do my risks sit. And to understand that, I also need to know not just what their risk is and what they're doing to address it, but what data am I sharing with them, right? Exactly. Like an understanding of like what assets do I have, whether digital or hard, that I'm actually putting out there, and then how are those sitting with those third parties, and what's the potential for an extortionware event based upon that information I know. And then taking that even back into legal and contracts and trying to figure out what's my responsibility. Given an event, like how do I have to notify which customer and when, and what's the timeline, and how drastic is the difference between customer A and B on what the notification deadlines are. I mean, it's a lot to manage. I mean, it just provides a very difficult infrastructure in which to work.
I think that the status quo, like you said, has been very much a static point in time type of a conversation that happens maybe once a year or once every other year, depending on kind of the inherent risk associated with a particular third party. What I hope we'll see in the future is having more of a continuous conversation. So when specific risks like ransomware, the evolution of extortionware start to come up and really emerge, let's keep having a conversation about specifically what are you doing, and what does your supply chain look like, how are you adjusting for this, that type of thing, rather than just being a one-off conversation and then it's reactive after the fact, like you said, like, okay, shoot, are we in trouble now? Like,
and
well,
you
maybe you should ask beforehand.
You mentioned maturity, right? It's a maturity conversation. I think if we're honest with ourselves, the way we're addressing ransomware, right? It was a long time ago. It was antivirus, right? Yeah. We had antivirus installed. Now it's endpoint protection, and now it's EDR, and they're all trying to address this case of ransomware or something happening, but they're not getting to the core process of there's a business process and there's things that you need to address, especially with the ransomware side, that aren't technology related, right? It's the business issue of like, have you had those conversations with legal? Have you had those conversations with your technology departments, right, to understand like what the data is, how you're transacting it? Have you done tabletop exercises? Have you actually run through all this stuff? And I would say from the maturity journey for most people, we're probably below 1, right? And we really need to be elevating that game and evaluating, how do we escalate and elevate the maturity to get to a level where the business can tolerate the risk.
Right, and I think what we've been seeing, you're right, the incremental, the maturity of questions really hasn't moved and so forth. It's just like some of the verbiage has changed, but it's like they're possession questions. Do you have this? Do you have this tool? Do you have this?
Have you thrown technology at it?
Right, exactly. But I think the opportunity there is for just better questions tied to those processes, right? Or tied to have you stress tested these either these products or these processes and so forth. Tabletops, great example and so forth. Or we're asking in-depth questions around again segmentation and so forth. Okay, if you get hit, how bad is it going to be?
Yeah.
Right, and asking some of those conversations. And I think they still can be, they still can be questions. They still can be static questions and so forth, but just really, kind of tie it to a risk and maybe not so much general frameworks and so forth. Let tie it to the actual risk and so forth and the impact and what we know really draws out that process and really draws out the actual loss.
Yeah.
I think what I'm hearing is a couple of things. One is the traditional approach to compliance, which says I checked all the boxes to say that I did the right thing, really is letting us down when it comes to dealing with the realities of the attacks that we're now facing, because there's a depth that's missing from that, and there's a currency that's missing from that, which needs to be addressed. I think the other thing I've heard you say is getting ahead of it means preparing in advance. Like, we shouldn't be surprised when we receive some kind of threat along these lines. Ransomware and extortionware, it's becoming more prevalent. It's affecting everyone in the room here and everyone who's watching us online. How can we get more prepared in advance? And what you said, Ben, requires an extraordinary amount of collaboration and cross-functional communication and coordination. Most of our teams don't have the kind of resources to just be able to layer on all this new additional effort and activity. What are the kinds of ways that you've been approaching this that is doable within the resource constraints that you have? What kind of innovations should we be looking for to implement to help us, move it up the stack, if you will?
Yeah, so I think obviously, like for me, and I talked about this before, like a lot of it is people trying to throw technology to solution, and I don't ultimately think it's technology, right? I think in this case there is technology that can be applied, but it should be done after you've got the right people and process in place. And so I think what process in this case means for me is, people should consider, do you have external counsel that's already retained? So when you have an issue, you're making one call and kicking off like essentially a war room, and external counsel is involved, external PR is involved, right? Your legal is in the loop, your internal PR is in the loop, you've got your technologists that are ready, and so you've got all the relevant stakeholders. And again, important to bring those external parties in, because while your chief legal may be really good at handling your business issues, they're probably really not up to speed on ransomware and extortion, right? They're probably not up to speed on all the potential issues for privacy that happen, right? So if you get an Extortionware event and somebody says, hey, I have data on customers in all 50 states, do you know what states that you actually have a privacy issue because birth date was included? It's only 2, right? So if you don't know that, and you don't report that, then now you're under a violation, right? So you need external counsel involved. You need to take a war room. You need to actually run this through a tabletop, and you need to involve your executive staff, right? They need to know, critical ransomware, extortionware is, are you going to pay? That's a big debate, right? Do you pay that event? And so I think that it's obviously different if it's a threat to life, if it's a healthcare and they've got the CAT scan machine and or the heart and lung machine, and they're going to turn that off. Or there's already been one incident in Europe where a patient had to be transferred and he died as a result of the event. I think that thing they're going to look at from an organizational business perspective. They're going to look for things that you have to monetize, and that's something you have to monetize. It's a threat for life, right? Critical infrastructure, right? The pipeline that we had issues with earlier this year. When Colonial went down, they decided to pay. I mean, I can understand potentially why they paid, right? I think we need to do more to look at how we don't pay, but you need to understand that answer to that question before you have an event, and then you're sitting around wasting time. Right, we talk about dwell time a lot, but in this case, it's response time. We need to minimize the response time. So your business leaders, are all weighing in. Your ELT kind of already knows what your perspective is. That doesn't mean when the situation happens, real-time events change things, right? In the fog of war, and what happens, you may have to respond in a different way that's planned. But at least you're starting. Everybody's on the same, conceptual idea of where we're starting from, right? Yes, if it's threat to life, we're going to pay. If it's not, we're not. If it's over a certain amount, right? If the impact of business is X, you've had those discussions, and so that informs the conversations and makes the issue a lot easier to go through when it happens. I mean, anything you can. I mean, that's.
Yeah, all that absolutely on the response side. I think another thing, because of the the evolution of ransomware into kind of what we're talking about as extortionware, is we've got to pay more attention to prevention as well. Obviously, response we can't ignore, but kind of in these cases, I like to say that the toothpaste is out of the tube. Once they've exfiltrated your data, you no longer have any control over what they do with it at that point. You can hope that if you pay a ransom, that they will be true to their word, but we are dealing with criminals, so there's a bit of an issue.
Doesn't happen all the time, David.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think another thing that we need to be focusing on, in addition to really practice and exercise responses and being aware of how we're going to respond in those incidents, is focusing more of our security programs on the preventative controls that would stop these types of attacks from being successful in the first place. Because, like I said, once the cat's out of the bag, it's really hard to get it back in there.
Yeah, and so what I would like to see too, and the point I was trying to make is all those things that Ben and excuse me, they've just brought up and so forth, things that they're looking at internally and so forth. Today, it's not trickling down to from my perspective down to ADP as a third party and so forth. Because they're all great questions, all great considerations and so forth. But I don't. Again, from my perspective, I'm not necessarily I'm not seeing, at least generally speaking, from the marketplace, unless the organization is really high and really mature on their monitoring practices and so forth. Because and pass those questions along and so forth. In contrast to just saying, have you been impacted?
Yeah. Have you found, Tim, that there's an openness to the dialogue for you to be able to educate your customers about the kinds of questions that they should be asking of you? And in the spirit of, we're in this together. The collaboration is at the heart and the center of really solving for this problem. It's going to rely on this community of cybersecurity professionals to really elevate this game and to provide a response that protects everyone. I say that only because it's very apparent that no one can cover all the bases on their own. But if we work together, we can get a corporate security, if you will, or community security evolving. And I'm wondering, Tim, in your dialogue with the customers that you talk to, when you get a question and you think to yourself, that's a good question, but it's not the best question. There's a better question that you could be asking of me that would give you something that would be more valuable to you. Right. And would actually help you improve your posture. Do you find that kind of conversation, is there an openness to that with your customers?
I'm encouraged that the number of times that happens and so forth, or the number of times that a client of ours is open to a conversation instead of a linear yes or no. Or, hey, or take the opportunity to kind of hear what we're doing. Or again, I do see more and more, again, I've been in my current role for over 5 years, more and more I am getting the request to have a conversation like, hey, what are you guys doing that I can take back and utilize internally and so forth. And those are really encouraging conversations. Yeah. But generally speaking, I still think today there's a lot of opportunity there to just, because a lot of times too, when it comes to things like ransomware and so forth, it is very much do you have a malware protection in place? Do you have an IR team in place, BCP, what have you? And then it is just that, have you been hit?
Well, you mentioned you have
economies of scale,
5,500, right? Responses that you've had to reply to. I think that's part of the core of this problem. That's like maybe stopping the dialogue in some cases. Is that just the nature of the scale requires automation and able to be able to do it effectively, because there's really no way you can actually. I mean, we're sending out questionnaires because that's all we can do.
Right.
Is send out a questionnaire, right? Where if we automated it and essentially drove the questionnaire and the response, essentially the dumb stuff, the easy stuff, right? We could have the people actually spend the time on the more in-depth, and once they understand what the risk profile is, dig down deeper into the areas where they're not seeing the responses that they like, and actually ask those more intelligent questions.
Would you say, do you think that scale could be reduced, to really, is it really an issue of like risk profile and so forth? Are you treating the, one vendor that may not have something as critical or provide a critical service to you as a principal business and so forth, and you're treating them the same as a critical part of your supply chain?
I think it's a mix of like what the criticality of the services they're providing and the data that I'm exchanging with them, right? So my concern for ransomware or an extortion event is like, if I'm not sending you anything other than public data, like it's bad that you had a ransomware event, but it really doesn't bother me that much, right? I mean, maybe exactly. I have to look at the risk from a supplier side of like, if you're down, maybe you're not supplying services to me, that's bad. But if I've exchanged really sensitive data with you and then you lose that data or that data gets exposed, that's really bad for me, right? That ultimately means maybe I have reporting requirements, or maybe I have with my suppliers to communicate something, right? So I think it's both understanding what the risk profile of how that vendor handles their program, and then matching that with essentially the context, the data, or my interaction, my business relationship with them.
Or how critical that vendor might be. Maybe it's not an exchange of data and so forth, but it's critical to what you're trying to provide.
Could be, yeah.
Then it becomes a business resilience
it's a
conversation.
Resilience question, yeah.
And I think you're raising a really important point, Tim, which is it possible to narrow the focus to the areas where the most risk is likely to manifest? How can we get ahead of this? I mean, if the average enterprise has upwards of 5,500 third parties in its ecosystem, how can we narrow that focus and be confident that we're talking to the right ones about the right things? I wonder if there's any innovations that you guys are experiencing or seeing to get ahead of this, because I think we would all love to be able to predict where that next attack is going to come from and take the remediation actions in advance to close those control gaps if they do exist. I mean, Dave, you're working with an exchange, 10,000 companies on the exchange today, sharing cyber risk information. What are you seeing in terms of best practice and how it's possible to go after? Is it possible to solve this problem?
It is. I'm an optimist. I think that it is. Something that Ben said kind of resonated. Finding ways to increase efficiency for our staff is key, because what I don't want to do is have a bunch of highly paid, highly skilled staff who are pushing spreadsheets around all day and trying to just manage that kind of a process. Right. What I want them to be doing is risk analysis, risk management, the actions on objectives for us, actually treating and addressing risk. And so I want to get to that as quickly as possible. So automation is clearly...
It's for your team too, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
nobody wants
those
that.
people, like, they don't want to do that.
We have a lot of other options than just pushing spreadsheets. So I think automation is key to that process, but using an exchange model, real quickly, what I'm talking about is using a structured data set for third-party risk solicitation of data, so that that data, once it's collected and processed and analyzed, can be shared with multiple different entities. So a third party kind of can use a do once, use many type of an approach. For the third-party perspective, that's a significant amount of efficiency that they get. I mean, Tim's a good example of
Absolutely.
that. Going from having to do 5,500 of these things, you can significantly reduce the number
Absolutely,
and the time.
it really does, like being able to proactively share data points and so forth with a group and so forth, have them, available on demand versus, having to being pulled, inquiry and find out who it needs to go to and so forth. And you're right, again, burnout from putting, filling out the same questions over and over and over again and so forth. And not seeing, not seeing that collaboration and so forth. And I'd say it's two things. From my perspective, it's all two things too. It's like we talked about the risk, understanding the risk profile and so forth, and really honing in on that. But I also think that the second stage of that is really kind of catering what you're asking, maybe outside of general frameworks and so forth, but we'll actually tie it to that emerging risk and so forth. And let the again, while conversations are hard and they don't scale well, but maybe like really sitting down and saying, okay, what are we doing internally and so forth, and how do we ask that and try to make it linear and gather those data, gather that data point efficiently.
I think with something like an emerging threat like ransomware or extortionware, we can be good partners to our customers as third parties, or the other way around, by, like you said, proactively providing information. We don't have to always wait for them. Like, wouldn't it be a fantastic, ideal kind of a world if something starts to stir up, some new type of a threat, and your third parties are proactively reaching out to you and saying, like, hey, here's all this information, just so you know. And they can do that in a very streamlined sort of a way with a concept like an exchange model.
Well, I also think, if you look at some of the recent events, the recent issues that have happened, like SolarWinds, right? I mean, I think one of the things that was beneficial for them is they were fast out of the gate with information, and they were transparent about the information, right? So the industry kind of respected them for that and dealt a positive return. I think for us, like what I'm looking for, and I continue to look for this in many different areas, but how can I be a better partner to the rest of the business, right? As a security professional, how can I elevate that CISO role up to a business leader role as opposed to a technical track role? And so one of those things is, where can I bring value? And I think being able to provide that information quickly, we're all selling something, right? Otherwise we're not in business. And so partnering with those teams to say, when you're getting in that third party request, it can't take 4 months to get a response back, right? Otherwise you're an impediment to contracts, you're an impediment to business. So if you can proactively provide and say, hey, open kimono, here's our profile, here's what we look like, here's how we do our stuff, right? Here's our third party posture, right? Along with any certification, SOC 2, those kind of things. Being able to provide that proactively, right? In something that's easily consumable, is a game changer. And that now you've got a partner in sales who's saying, hey, we love the security team because they're enabling us, right?
Right, I think it is a differentiator either in the market and so forth, but it's a lot of things. Yeah, and I think traditionally and so forth, when you were, my experience too, the security questions wouldn't come until after there was some sort of deal in place and so forth. Now there's a lot of opportunities to differentiate yourself in the marketplace and or just provide that. There's value in providing that assurance up front, and usually it does make the sales cycle a little easier and so forth. And there is, again, the questions are coming and so forth. Doesn't matter.
Everybody's interested in this right now, right? I mean, it's risen to that executive level visibility, right? I mean, cyber is for most companies now, one of the number one risks they're addressing, right, at the board level. And so that's functioning at a trickle down with money, with people, right, with headcount usually. Budgets aren't being, if they're being restricted due to COVID and other things, not usually being restricted as much in cyber as they are in other areas of the organization for most people. At least that's what I'm seeing. I don't know if you guys are seeing the same thing. But one result of that is you have to be able to apply those resources correctly, right?
Right, and I think one of the things that I do see as part, is being able to take that data set, is being able to share not just with, to the CISO, to the audit committee or whomever, what questions are being asked, what's really of concern and so forth, can be a real powerful, business driver and so forth. And help the business and or security, provide the right resources in the right area and so forth, but overlay that and say, this is what the market is expecting, or this is what, is an emerging threat and so forth. Maybe not, it could be it could be optics, it could be a business driver, it could be what have you, and it really does, the visibility and so forth really is very powerful and so forth. When you have things that you have to address, there's always additional protections that need to be put in place and so forth. But be able to put that customer centric view on what that perceived gap could be and so forth, or that response or that emerging threat that is on the mind of not just their security assessors, but to those main stakeholders that are investing in your company.
I think you're raising a super important point here, which is the visibility that's coming into this area is causing us to need to be able to respond in a way that can educate those who are not well informed about the work that we do. They're not deeply involved in the information security function, but they are entirely reliant upon it for their well-being and the success of the company. And as a result, I feel as if there's new demand on us as InfoSec professionals to be able to communicate upwards in the organization to our investors, to our boards, to those who are key stakeholders in ways that they can understand how we're approaching the problem, how we're able to focus on the right areas of the problem to solve, and the kinds of strategies we're putting in place. Feels like that's a new demand that's coming along.
It is, and I think it's important on us. Like, we have to realize as security professionals, part of the reason why we're there is to provide advice and consultation, right? We understand the area, we understand the context, and so I think it's contingent upon us when your board or your ELT comes and says, hey, we really hear a lot about third-party risk or ransomware, extortionware. Like, it's easy to run off. We've talked a lot about it's these third parties we deal with, right? Our data's out there. Well, if you don't know what your data is that's out there, that's a huge problem. I think it's contingent upon us to highlight those areas like asset management. Like, do you know where all your cloud-based assets are? Do you know where all your temporal workloads are? Do you know what the data is shared with partners is? Have you organized that data and structured it such that this data is sensitive, this data isn't sensitive, this data is related to privacy, this data isn't? And so if when you have an incident, when you have something happen, if you can't look back on that really quick and contextualize and say, okay, here's what was potentially compromised. I know the records, I know where they're located, I know the third parties that they're at, I have the profiles. You need to be able to bring all that data back. But it's really important not to just that knee jerk of, hey, we're concerned about third parties. Okay, let me go do a lot more third party stuff. It's like, do you have your internal process in place first? And do you know where all your data is? And then how do you marry that with all that third party information?
So I'm encouraged, actually, what I've seen over the last couple of years and so forth. GDPR was a great driver on that data inventory piece. Saw a big, influx of information. It's funny though, clients that have been for decades and so forth, and then they would send us a question: how many records do you have?
Yeah. How many of our records do you have?
Exactly. And what's in them? But I'm really, again, however we get there is great, right? And so forth, whatever's that driver. You're right, understanding. So I am encouraged. I am starting to see more of those kind of, understanding those profiling questions and so forth. And so I think I'm really kind of encouraged by that. But I want to make sure it's not leveraged, not outside of just privacy compliance and so forth. Really, kind of that risk profile.
I mean, for people who haven't been involved on the maturity scale, I mean, GDPR was good. I think it did there were some benefits out of that. It was a challenge for a lot of people, but there were benefits. But I do find it frustrating sometimes the number of people who, like I've talked to, that said they did their GDPR exercise, continually, right? Like, not just one time, but they did it. They did it. They found out what was in scope. They stopped, right? And I think that's where, again, it's a process issue. You need to constantly be evolving.
You can say the same thing about those baseline security assessments, right? Exact same thing, same process. Absolutely. There has to be more. Again, most security. I mean, it's usually a meme nowadays, right? Security to the level of compliance is not really comforting.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Well, we've come a long way in this conversation this afternoon, and I want to thank you all for the very rich dialogue and discussion. I hope everyone here got something out of today's discussion that they can take back and apply directly. I think the key thing that I would keep in mind is there's a lot of innovation happening in this space, not just on the adversarial side, but actually from a protection and defense perspective. There are things that we can do. There are new ways to approach this problem, and of course, we'd be delighted to help you understand how we think at CyberGRX. This session, I hope, has given you some insights to that. But before we go, I did want to give each member of the panel an opportunity to just give you one thing. If there was one thing that you could take away from today that would help you to take action immediately to address this issue of ransomware and extortionware, what would that be? Tim, maybe I could start with you.
I think just quite simply, and I think we've hit it on a couple of times, but just from my perspective and my role and so forth, is just have, that dialogue. We're just, again, and again, scale's hard, but I think just generally I would just leave it as, just try to ask better questions and challenge those both internally and externally to understand, and move away from the linear and start having more of those conversations and so forth, but tied to the ransomware, extortionware risk and so forth. And again, the example I use all the time and so forth is, do you have a BCP or do you have malware protection? Okay, great. And those are great questions and so forth. But you go deeper into the processes and go deeper into the communication and the inner workings and so forth. Most companies and so forth, I think, would be happy to kind of share, what they're doing and so forth. And I think it's really depending on, what the risk is and that risk profile and so forth, to kind of understand what that is and so forth. And there are challenges there, and I think my opportunity is to try and to ask those questions and ask them to be able to do them at scale.
Yeah.
Ask better questions. Thank you, Tim. Dave, what's your one word of advice for this guy?
I think, thinking about ransomware and extortionware, I mentioned it before. I think we have to shift our focus a little bit, maintain a solid response capability, but we have to start talking more and more about prevention. It's not good enough to say, oh, well, I've got offline backups and I test my ability to recover from backup every week or something. That's great, so you can recover from a traditional ransomware attack, but the evolution of extortionware means that the traditional methods for response aren't going to get us out of trouble. And the only way to really prevent some of the reputational risk and that kind of thing that you're talking about earlier is to prevent the attack from happening in the first place. And most often that has something to do with identity. So I think focusing in on prevention, specifically around identity controls, is probably one of the key things that we can do.
Thank you, Dave. Protect, not just defend. And Ben, what's your word of advice?
And so I think the contrary viewpoint to that a little bit, right? I'd say obviously you've got to try to protect, right? But at the end of the day, there's a likelihood just based upon the amount of data that you share, the people you deal with, right, the third party, that there's going to be some point where that data could get exposed or breached, right? And so if that happens, you've got to be prepped for that event before it happens. If you walk into that room with your CEO and your chief of legal and say, hey, it's hit the fan, and they say, well, what do we do? And you go, I don't know, we haven't talked about it. That's probably a bad day for you, right? I think what you really have to know is, hey, I've already called chief of legal. We've got an external counsel on the phone. We've got a bridge set up in 15 minutes. Everybody will be on the call. We understand this is a ransomware event. The ask is X dollars. And we know generally that we don't think, based upon the impact of business, that we want to pay that. Let's talk about it on the call and see what's changed. But that's where we start. Your CEO is going to have a lot more confidence in you when you walk into that room with that discussion than if you say, I don't know, right? So I totally agree on the prevent, but I think just prep and be ready, right?
Yeah.
Make sure that you can address those issues.
Good advice for Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts everywhere. Be prepared. Everyone, thank you so much for attending today's event. Thank you to our panel for the great discussion, and enjoy the rest of your Black Hat 2021. Thank you so much. Thank you.